Alrighty, welcome to day 2 of reInvent, and thank you for making it to this session. So really excited to talk to you all today about protecting and governing your data on AWS. My name is Nancy Wang. I'm the General Manager for AWS Data Protection Services, and I'm joined here today with my colleague Satish.
Thank you, Nancy. Good morning, everyone. My name is Satish. I'm the Managing Director for Specialized Sales, Business Development, and Solution Architecture for all storage services in our portfolio. I know you all have a choice to decide which session to attend. We're grateful for the opportunity to connect and speak to all of you on this particular topic.
And I'm also really looking forward to connecting with you all after the session as well in a Q&A. So let's get started. Today's agenda will be covering some key topics in the area of data protection and governance, starting with how do you create and consume data today on AWS. Then we'll move into talking about the layers of data protection and governance, then some baseline controls for data protection on AWS, and finally putting it all together in some real-world scenarios with architecture diagrams for how you can implement AWS data protection and governance in your environment today. So here are some examples of very common data workloads, which I'm sure you probably have all or a combination of in your environment, starting with structured data. So these are the Redshifts, RDS instances in your environment, with semi-structured data, DynamoDB, DocumentDB, and of course, unstructured data with S3 objects, with Elastic File Systems, FSx. And so as application and analytics workloads increasingly converge on S3 today, we'll anchor our examples that we cover in this presentation from the perspective of an S3 bucket, using data protection and governance services on AWS. The amount of data that's being generated today creates a balancing act that exists between access and control to data. This balancing act occurs with all workload types, whether it's applications, business intelligence, analytics, and machine learning. There's a fine line between the ability to use that data and the ability to extract business value out of that data, versus ensuring that the usage is correct and also follows the policies that you and your organization has set in terms of data governance. So what this boils down to is really that trust in that data is mutual. It's about businesses being able to trust their data, as well as external parties trusting businesses with how they handle their data. So the reason that comprehensive data protection and governance is such a challenging problem to solve is that the path of least resistance is to just use that data as is. I mean, it's a lot harder to think about the correct context of your data and also asking yourself, am I using this data correctly in the application that I'm building? It's also a lot harder to build out the platform and also the scaffolding to ensure that the data is being used properly. For example, storing data that is encrypted in a database and then using application-level decryption. For many of us, this is probably not yet second nature. So this is where having a secure platform comes in handy. AWS provides you the primitives to build a secure platform and scaffolding. A recommended mental model towards governance on AWS is to look at it in tiers, with emphasis on the hierarchy of control types that exist in your environment. So for our talk today, we're going to focus on data protection and governance, which comprise the baseline assurance controls for holistic data security. Let's start with data protection. There are two core tenets of a good data protection strategy: a focus on data durability, which is a function of technology, and a focus on data resiliency, security, and controls, which is a function of external factors. With respect to their data, customers care about data durability, availability, and resiliency. Data durability is important on both primary and secondary data. So for example, FSx ONTAP snapshots on the same media and those that can be archived into different media with worm-based lock on the backup vault. And that is a function of technology. Data resiliency is there to protect our data and is a function of human factors, errors or bad actors. Examples of that include version control, worm configurations, snapshots, having multiple copies of your backups, and also different protection domains. So now that we've covered what the layers of data governance and protection are on AWS, let's discuss baseline controls that comprise data protection. So starting off, data visibility. That's how data is found. Next, durability and resiliency, making sure that data isn't lost and that data survives any incidents that occur. And finally, security and controls, making sure that your data isn't stolen. Because it's so easy to spin up resources in the cloud, and because resource creation is decentralized, what we often get is data asset sprawl that can run rampant. So a comprehensive data protection and governance strategy starts with visibility. As the old adage goes, you can't protect what you can't see. So that's why shadow IT and shadow data present one of the biggest risks to a data visibility strategy that is comprehensive and secure for your organization. Having an incomplete data visibility strategy can lead to data loss and people misusing data, and also those activities not being properly tracked. So therefore, an inability to identify and remediate data usage can put your organization at compliance risk. So what are some common goals then among customers when they think about data visibility? So here's some pretty frequent questions that I get from customers, starting with, how do I implement the ability to review all actions that are taken in my environment? Next, how do I determine the current state and posture of my data platforms and how they've changed over time? Then, how do I ensure data usage is compliant with the legal, regulatory, or contractual policies, for example, DPAs? And finally, how do I, as an organization, do this correctly and properly at scale? So here are some AWS services that can help you understand the consumption of your data. So first off, AWS Config can tell you about the data platforms that you currently have in your environment. It enables you to assess, audit, and also evaluate the configuration of your AWS resources. CloudTrail and CloudWatch, for example, combined, provide insight into how these data platforms are being consumed by organizations. And specifically for analytics and ML workloads, Glue catalogs can also be used to provide additional visibility into the types of data sets that are present in your environment. So putting it all together, this is an example of how you can use the services that we just covered to ensure visibility for your data estate. AWS Config can help you identify all of your outstanding S3 buckets. CloudTrail, with data events enabled, can allow you to understand all the actions that are taken by principals on that S3 bucket. Together, this gives you comprehensive visibility into what exists and also how it's being used. A key use case this combination can enable you is to identify S3 buckets that have stale or radioactive data. Any buckets that haven't been used or analyzed for over a year can now be flagged for safe removal. So now that we understand what types of data are present in your environment, let's talk about making it resilient and durable. To start, customers want always-on data resiliency and durability. And as we previously covered, a customer's data estate can often span multiple AWS services. Therefore, AWS is ensuring that these core principles apply across the platform. Customers want centralized, intent-based, and policy-driven mechanisms that help them ensure data resiliency and durability. And once enabled, durability and availability keep our customers' businesses online 24/7. So I'm sure that you all have probably seen this diagram in one shape or form, right? And this is a slide from the perspective of AWS infrastructure. This slide holds equally true for data that's on AWS. AWS has implemented world-class data durability and resiliency. And the interface by which customers can implement this are our policies. Resiliency is a shared responsibility between AWS and the customer. And so it's important to understand how disaster recovery, availability as part of resiliency operate under this shared model. So with policy as our interface in mind, here are 2 AWS services that you can start using right away to build data resiliency and also durability. AWS is our centralized data protection service for AWS, spanning multiple AWS services and compute, database, file systems. Customers use it today to protect, restore, and also audit their protection of these AWS workloads for compliance. And also in the event that your mission-critical data is fully contained within disk, we also offer AWS Elastic Disaster Recovery Service for your EBS volumes. So AWS Backup covers 12 services right now, but it could also be 30 or more in the future. This is a service that scales with AWS growth. The main attraction to our customers has been the cloud-native aspect of this data protection service. It works in the cloud with the same microservices that you might use for your primary applications. And it's also able to bring in other integrations as needed. So utilize AWS Backup to create backup policies that comprise plans to orchestrate backup operations across supported AWS services. Create audit, compliance, alerts, reports, and dashboards across all of your backups with CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and SNS integrations. Control access to your sensitive data that's contained in your backups with IAM integrations. And finally, protect your backups with cross-account, cross-region backups, as well as the ability to apply a warm lock on your backup vault. Now that we've talked about expressing data resiliency and durability as policies and the services that vend these capabilities, let's see how we can apply that to an S3 bucket. You can restore S3 buckets, prefixes, or objects to a point in time with a single click. You can also restore S3 buckets to another existing bucket or a new bucket. And this feature actually just went out in public preview. So if you're interested in trying it out in your environment today, please contact me offline. So one of the interesting trends that we're seeing right now with AWS Backup and our data protection portfolio is an emphasis on data protection anywhere, with customers using AWS Backup to centrally configure, manage, and govern their backup and restore activities across AWS compute, database, file, and block storage, as well as object storage. We're excited to announce today the support for AWS S3, as well as the general availability of VMware support on premises. With the support for S3, customers can replace custom scripts they use to manage their S3 backups. And with AWS Backup support for VMware, customers can protect their VMware workloads, whether they're on premises or in VMware Cloud on AWS, using the same policies and features that they're already familiar with AWS Backup. Now that we've covered data visibility, resiliency, and durability, let's talk about security and controls for your data. As you're probably already aware and implementing in your environment, IAM today allows policies by tag. This flexibility allows for some very key, powerful permissioning models. For example, you can use tag-based access controls to implement a classification-based access control for your organization. So rather than individually granting access to resources, access can now be granted based on classification. For example, a principal or group can access anything that is tagged PII. These tags can be granted or generated as part of organizational diligence, or even with the assistance of services such as Macie. that can classify content. Further extending the previous concept, organizations can now put in place a policy that data of different categories require different tags. You can use AWS services to ensure that data fitting PII is encrypted with a different key, separate from data that belong in other categories. This can help further bolster data residency requirements for your organization. And keep in mind, a proactive data security posture combined with always-on data visibility keeps your data perimeter secure and sensitive data compliant. VPCs can be another way to ensure that data can only be accessed by certain parties. The biggest use case for something like this is to help with data residency requirements. VPC peering can also lead to secure data sharing practices. For example, you can have an RDS database that's located within a VPC that belongs to the primary organization. But via a shared VPC, a partner organization can also gain access to that database. So now let's tie it all together via a defense in-depth strategy. The first line of defense is focused on the identity access management constructs, which form a trust radius for your customer. For example, providing multi-factor authentication tokens that deny potential attackers access to your organization. The second line defense is automated monitoring of your security perimeter in case an attacker breaches that perimeter, be it your VPC, your AWS organizations, or your AWS accounts. Our customers tell us that they want to monitor resource configurations and know when someone changes an S3 KMS key or when their resource metadata matches patterns and indicators that could suggest a ransomware attack. This can also include mechanisms that provide time delays that give organizations much needed time to respond to anomalous activity. The last line defense focuses on backup storage and achieving restore RTOs in the cloud and on premises, ensuring customers can deploy to a known good data set as quickly as the attacks can occur. And of course, controls such as cross-region and cross-account management protections, including active auditing and alerting against protection policies, provide an additional layer of protection for ransomware. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague Satish, who will put it into practice using data protection and security to mitigate and recover from ransomware. Satish?
Thank you, Nancy. Well, that's going to be a tough act to follow. Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to, in this particular role, I have the privilege of working with customers all over the globe. And what we have realized in our interactions over the last decade or so, talking to customers, we've identified a common set of practices that these customers are adopting to protect, back up, recover from either ransomware attacks or disasters. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the next portion of today's discussion specifically talking about those common practices and common themes that we have identified, with the expectation that we'll share some of these best practices with you, and perhaps through this discussion we'll be able to learn bespoke practices that you're adopting that'll help us improve some of these recommendations. So that's going to be the next part of the presentation. Nancy talked about the 3 pillars that are foundational to any data protection and governance strategy. She talked about data visibility, resilience and durability, and about security and controls. If you think about all the services within our portfolio and the capabilities of these services that get enhanced every day, this can often be fairly overwhelming and challenging for customers. So how do they adopt the right architecture for their workloads? Because if you think about the customer journey, most of our customers are in varying points of migration. Some have totally exited data centers, have migrated all of their applications to AWS. Others have started to migrate those workloads, so they're in varying points of the customer journey. How do they adopt these best practices? What types of services and architectures do they actually deploy? The best way for our customers to identify the right architecture that gives them the protection, the resiliency, the performance, the controls, the visibility is something we call the well-architected review. What our customers tend to do over the last 10 years, our solution architects and our customers' architectures for workloads that they have started or migrated to the cloud have been collated and documented into a set of recommended architectures for almost every workload. This, one of the pillars in the well-architected review is security and compliance. And for those who have not actually looked at a workload and gone through a well-architected review, I highly recommend you actually try that out. You can typically use a solution architect's resource that's available from AWS to help you through identifying the right architecture that gives you the right balance of cost, performance, and security, or you can leverage more than hundreds of partners who are capable of performing a well-architected review. In addition to it, we've identified about 4 common patterns that I'm going to talk about on this slide that are helping our customers architect the right solution. Nancy talked about data visibility, and she introduced several services that are available to you to make sure you really understand where your data is stored, how your data is accessed, who has the right permissions and policies, and do you have even the right set of software patches available to make sure that you're well protected and your workloads are performant. Beyond that, what we are recognizing is customers are using individual capabilities or services in our portfolio, and I'll talk about 2 in particular that help with data visibility. About a year ago, exactly about a year ago at re:Invent, we introduced S3 Lens. I'll talk about S3 Lens in a little bit more detail on the next slide. Essentially, it gives customers, this was our customers coming to us and asking us for more granularity and visibility into permissions and access for clients who may be using S3 buckets. S3 Lens provides you detailed metrics, up to 29 metrics along a different set of vectors, and those metrics provide dedicated recommendations that IT managers who are using S3 buckets can act on. The second functionality is access points, multi-region access points. If you have a distributed workforce and you want to limit access to certain buckets, and this is becoming more important as customers are migrating their workloads into an S3-based data lake. When they do that, they have users who may have access to specific buckets. You may have an individual user accessing one bucket. Each one of those accesses require dedicated policies and dedicated governance criteria. So access points and multi-region access points gives you the tools and the flexibility to do so. So those are the 2 capabilities in addition to the system-level services that are available, customers are using to control access to their data. When it comes to data durability and resiliency, customers tend to use either versioning, lifecycle, replication, and most importantly, golden copies. It's important to make sure that you have a golden copy or even a CloudFormation template of your entire workload available in either a vault or in a dedicated bucket with separate protection policies to make sure that in the event of an attack, you can recover from that particular configuration. Security and controls. We talked a lot about technologies, the services that are fully managed services that are available in our portfolio for security and control, but there are really 2 dimensions that dictate whether you're truly prepared either for an attack or recover quickly from an attack. So it's people and technology that one needs to be aware of. When it comes to people specifically, are the individuals who are configuring those workloads and managing those workloads in AWS, do they have the right skill sets or not? In addition to the training and certification programs we make available for our solution architects, we also have, as a part of the well-architected framework, hands-on labs available for your IT staff to help them understand what's the right architecture for the workload that gives them the best performance, gives them the best security, and gives them the right compliance and governance capabilities. So I highly encourage those who have not looked at a well-architected framework to go to the AWS website. There's a checklist and a set of resources available. I encourage all of you to try to see if you can put a workload through it and get some recommendations on how best to architect that. So people, skill set of the individuals, giving them access to training, giving them opportunities to engage in hands-on lab definitely help with exercising security and controls. Last but not least is monitoring. Active monitoring and preparing for potential attacks is extremely important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. On the previous slide, I mentioned S3 Lens, which we launched about a year ago, the re:Invent last time. Unfortunately, it was a virtual event. It's an interactive dashboard experience that is available directly from the S3 console, and it's free for all customers. It gives you organizational-wide capability, and as I said earlier, this was an ask for customers who wanted granularity not just at the organizational level, but they wanted it down to the bucket as well as prefix level, and for visibility into where data was within each of their storage classes. So whether you're using infrequent access or one zone, they wanted to make sure that they had visibility into what data was where, if data was encrypted or not, if data had been replicated, and who actually had permissions to access that data. So this service was really introduced in our portfolio to give customers granular usage and activity metrics. We have thousands of customers today on this particular service directly available from the S3 console who are using this for better visibility into data. Last but not least, even though this service can help you with cost optimization and improve your ROI in AWS Cloud, one of the bigger benefits is you can use this for data protection best practices. You can look at your S3 buckets and you can identify, just as an example, maybe 35%, 50% of your buckets are unencrypted. And you can then decide what actions you want to take. So those who have not tested this particular feature or have not used this feature, highly encourage you to do so. The other thing Nancy talked about was using a backup vault. Backup vaults are containers, logical entities where backup resources and copies can be stored and managed. I'll talk to you about a scenario and show you an architecture of how this is actually implemented in real life. But it's extremely important and highly recommended for cloud-native backups, so you get vault-level protection. In addition, we have within each of our services in our portfolio, we have WORM, write once, read many capabilities built into our storage services. And it's important to understand the governance as well as compliance options available to you. So for the retention period, even a root user does not have the ability to either delete or overwrite that particular file. So it's important to understand exactly what applications need this level of compliance and governance and make sure the right set of policies as well as accesses are available to your users. And reducing the risk of downtime and building a foundation for disaster recovery, we'll talk about this in a minute, will help you recover fast. So in closing on the first part of the presentation, the takeaways that I recommend is if you have workloads running in AWS, consider the well-architected framework. Consider looking at whether the architecture you're using for your workloads are optimal for performance, resiliency, cost, and security. Second, consider using individual services. It's great to have organizational view and account level view with System Manager. It's absolutely paramount to use AWS config to make sure you're using the right configurations and the parameters and policies don't deviate from what is desired in the ideal configuration. But it's equally important to leverage the features and functionalities available of the underlying services to make sure you know who has access to data, what accesses do they have, are they the right set of policies, and whether you want to basically create additional policies and additional governance across them. Speaking to our customers, we've realized that their journey to the cloud kind of comes in 3 levels of complexity in 3 steps. Unless you happen to be a customer who's made a decision to exit data centers and migrate all the workloads to the cloud, what we have noticed is the first step that most customers take in migrating to the cloud is doing backup and restore. Now, that backup and restore could be because they don't want a secondary data center. They continue to want to run primary workloads on premises and basically want a secondary copy in the cloud. That's one scenario. The other scenario is maybe they want to use it for DR purposes and will, on a regular basis, test the validity of that backup, of that data in a cloud environment. Or that may be a first step in the migration of all of their workloads to the cloud. So backup, restore, and archive happen to be one of the first few workloads we talk about to customers. So we're going to spend a little bit of time about why backup, restore, and archive, in addition to the preparedness, in addition to having visibility and having the right policies for your users, it's also important to make sure that you have a golden copy. You have a backup of your data that in the event of a disaster, you have the ability to quickly recover. The second step in terms of complexity is actually recovering from a ransomware attack. And we'll actually walk through a scenario today that happened at a customer and how long it took them to get back to business as usual. And last but not least, the most complicated and perhaps the most expensive, depending on your RPO and RTO requirements, is disaster recovery. And we'll talk about that as well. So let's start with the first, the simplest of them, which is backup. Nancy talked about really exciting capabilities in AWS backup, in virtual environments as well as S3 backup. That's in preview. But essentially, our customers have a lot of choice. If you have a heterogeneous environment in an on-premises data center, and what I mean by heterogeneous environment means if you have maybe an Dell EMC or an HP block storage system, you may have a NetApp filer for running NAS and SMB applications. Maybe you have a third-party object storage system, or maybe you are using a HCI system, right, for hyperconverged infrastructure, and you want to back those up to the cloud. Customers are using third parties. However, for cloud-native applications, for the best level of integration across our portfolio, specifically Amazon RDS, DynamoDB, and if you're wanting to back up to EBS or to S3, AWS Backup is our recommended service, and customers use that as well, along with the backup APIs. So customers have a choice depending on the on-premises environment they have and which service they use. Some customers use Storage Gateway as well, with the backup capability natively integrated into the Storage Gateway. That allows them to decide what they want to do in a hybrid environment. So you essentially have a choice, and backup, in addition to making sure you have the right accesses and policies, is an important first step to making sure you're ready for a potential attack. The second step is, how do you recover? We looked at 2 analyst reports. These are third-party reports that talked about how important it is to really be ready for a potential attack. Gartner's done an analysis saying 75% of IT organizations will face 1 or more ransomware threats by 2025. So that's 3 out of the 4 people in this room potentially will have to, face the eventuality. The second is how often it happens, right? What's your level of risk and vulnerability? It can happen once every 11 seconds and $20 trillion. So it's a massive problem. I mean, I can tell you over the last 1.5, 2 years that I've been talking to customers, this is pretty much top of mind. It's not just true about regulated industries. It is definitely true about traditional enterprises as well. So it's super important to make sure you're well prepared and be able to respond. Talking to customers, we've realized that there are fundamentally 3 reasons why somebody is more vulnerable than others. The first reason is technical maintenance is behind schedule, right? Which means either your patching is not up to date, you really have irregular and untested backups, and your manual processes are extensive and time-consuming. AWS Config and a lot of the capabilities Nancy talked about really help you overcome some of these challenges and take you away from more manual processes to more automated capabilities. The second is employee behavior creates security risks. That doesn't mean that anyone has malicious intent. It's just that they may not have the skills and the right set of training. So if you remember what I said earlier about the well-architected review, I talked about hands-on labs. I talked about training and certification. I talked about engaging partners who are certified to make sure they have the right architecture. And making sure that the employees and the IT administrators who are managing those workloads fully understand what is required before you can successfully recover from an attack. And the third means the strategy you got to make sure that your strategy prepares you for attack. So you cannot have excessively permissive credentials. If you have S3 buckets that don't need public access, block public access. If you have a lot of data, structured, unstructured, stored in S3, make sure it's encrypted, right? If you want to maintain a golden copy in perhaps a different region, make sure you're replicating it. One of the capabilities we introduced within S3, in the last 12 months or so, which is replication time control. Thousands of our customers are using that, where they want a guaranteed SLA that 99.99% of the data, when gets replicated, can happen within 15 minutes. That helps you with minimizing your RTO duration. So think about what you can do to improve the technical capabilities of your staff. Think about, do you understand where your data sits, whether it's replicated or not? Who has access to it? What should be the right policies? Do you have a backup? Is it air-gapped? Is it vaulted? Do you have the right permissions to access it? And in the event of a breach, how will you quickly recover from it? All these things really matter. It's important to plan for it. Because the reality is, as the data showed on the previous slide, planning and being ready is as important as being able to recover from it. There are two major dimensions that one should definitely think about for every workload that may be running in AWS. Your RPO, right, recovery point objective, and your time objective, and they mean two different things. There are some business critical workloads that actually may require zero RPO and zero RTO. But more often than not, there is always some tolerance for you to be able to lose some data or be able to how quickly you'll be able to recover. So for those in the room who may not recognize these terms, I'll quickly define them. RPO is how much of your data you can afford to lose. So let's say it's noon today and there was an event, you had an RPO of 1 hour. It means that you will have access to any data that's from 11 a.m. and prior. RTO is how quickly you can recover. If your RTO is 4 hours, it means that if you have a down, could be a ransomware event or a data center shutdown, and you want to bring it up in the cloud, you can do that in about 4 hours or so from that event. So really understanding exactly what your RPO and RTO expectations are for each of your workloads is equally important, and that needs to be integrated into the plan, not just about access policies, not just about making sure you have the right permissions, making sure you have the right security patches. It's also important to understand what your RPO and RTO expectations are. The framework that is an old framework, I think it's from year 2012, is the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is what most of our customers are using as they think about it. Many of them think about the detection and respond aspects of the NIST framework. What I'm trying to emphasize today, based on all of our customers who are successfully able to plan and recover from ransomware attacks, is the importance of identity and identifying and protection. So specifically to identify, Nancy and I talked about creating trust radius. So making sure have visibility into who has your access to data, what permissions do they have, and once you understand what permissions you need to give to individuals accessing the data, you need to make sure you create a trust radius with your IAM controls. The second piece of it is make sure you have multi-factor authentication. That's also a common way of making sure the right individuals with the right permissions are accessing the data. The third is in terms of protection, and I've listed 5 or 6 different ways customers are protecting the data, which is automated monitoring. You got to make sure your VPC, your organizations, your accounts are well monitored. The second is you have to monitor your resource config specifically when it comes to storage. Now, what do I mean by that? Change to Amazon S3 if you recognize a sudden deletion within your S3 bucket. If you see your AWS keys being suddenly exposed or changed. If you see your metadata suddenly getting encrypted. These are all triggers of a potential attack. Third is making sure you have cross-region and cross-account backup. Right? While you may have a backup copy in AWS of an on-premises environment, do you have that replicated between zones? Do you have it replicated across regions? Do you have an air-gapped golden copy of your data, and not just your data, your entire workload in a CloudFormation template, so in the event of a breach, you're able to recover very quickly from it. Last but not least, are you actively auditing and monitoring your VPCs, your accesses, your controls, and are you using vaults in the event of compliance and governance? So here are different options for you, and I think you'll have to look at every workload and the requirements of your organization to decide if all of them or some of them are more relevant for you. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the next few minutes talking about how do you recover and respond. All these 5 capabilities, if you think about the NIST framework, right, going from left to right, we talked about Systems Manager, we talked about AWS Config. These are services available to you to really identify, and the capabilities within the services. I talked about S3 Lens. I talked about multi-region access points. So a lot of services have rich capabilities that let you identify who has the right permissions and assess whether they have the right permissions or not. The second piece of it is protect, right? So which is a list of services shown on this particular slide, which is identity access management, IAM, secrets manager, making sure you have the right keys, people have the right access to the keys, firewall manager, web application firewall, capabilities. All these enable you to actually be able to track and monitor. In terms of protecting, I'm showing you a series of services on the top. You have AWS Security Hub, where you can look across your accounts within the AWS organization and identify what alerts to actually react to. So, if you have a lot of workloads using a bunch of services as a part of that architecture, each of the services may be triggering alerts, and it's important to know which ones to act on, and Security Hub is a great service that helps you do that. When you think about GuardDuty and Amazon Inspector, these are actively monitoring your VPCs. They could be monitoring your S3 buckets, and then Macie helps you identify within your S3 bucket PII information that could be potentially exposed. So this is the way you actively protect and monitor. In terms of investigation, in the event of a breach, you can always look at your CloudWatch and your CloudTrail logs, but analyzing, to Nancy's point earlier, analyzing those CloudTrail logs with Amazon Athena or using Amazon Detective as a way of going through the logs and conducting a security investigation are important services that are available to you as well. And eventually, using AWS Backup and AWS Disaster Recovery Services, Cloud Endure platform is a great way for you to recover if the worst should ever happen. So you have a lot of services, and this is why a lot of our customers are using the well-architected framework to make their life easier, because they have a lot of choices and a lot of decision points that they have to make. And the well-architected framework helps them, even for verticalized industries and customers who may be in, let's say, financial services, customers who may have edge endpoints and potentially security threats, are able to use the well-architected framework to make sure they're deploying the right workloads in the right way. Let's talk about an actual architecture. So this is a hybrid environment from a customer deployment. They have a couple of data centers. They're using Direct Connect to make sure they have a low latency, high bandwidth network. Within the AWS region, they're using a staging account. And that staging account has a replicated copy in what we call a KAB vault, which is a cross-account backup vault. In this vault is where they maintain the golden copy of the data and the configuration. And in the event of a breach, let's say an on-prem, they can quickly create a recovery account, and if needed, they can do vault forensics. So this is the high-level architecture of how customers in a hybrid environment could maintain a backup copy of their workloads in AWS and be able to recover to an event that actually happened on premise. Let's talk a little bit about an actual ransomware event. And in this case, I'm going to protect the innocent. We don't have the name of the customer here, but it's a real-world scenario. So what happened was an employee was hit by social engineering. I think it was an email. There was an application agent. This particular individual decided they were going to click on that agent, and that agent then ran some malware on the system. They gained access to their Active Directory and Windows logins. That happened in the first 12 hours. Then it started to really spread through most of the system. Phones were down. The Active Directory was completely destroyed. Windows logins were disabled and had to be disabled, and people lost email access. IT got involved. They decided that they were going to isolate the environment. So they eliminated all personal email, basically started to move to cell phone and personal email-based communications. It took about 3 weeks. It took about 3 weeks to do the following, to recover. So they had to go to local backups that were not impacted. There were no NAS backups whatsoever, so there were only snapshots. And they had basically a snapshot rollback had to be initiated, and they ran into, over the 3 weeks or so, when they were trying to recover from that particular event, they were having extremely high IOPS and super high latency. So they weren't able to get back to the performance of the workloads before the ransomware attack really happened. And eventually, they had to scrap a lot of hardware, and they had to rebuild and restore. So not only was this a challenge of being on premises where it took them weeks to really order new hardware, bring it up and running, and make sure that they were able to recover all their workloads and applications. So the users had to deal with poor performance for 3 weeks, and it took much longer for them to completely get back to the old state. So this is the challenge of what happens if you don't plan well enough, meaning you don't have the visibility, you don't have the knowledge and the training, and you don't have the ability to quickly recover. This is what happens in the real world. So let's talk about disaster recovery. God forbid, something like this happens, how would you recover from it? I talked about RPO, RTO, and there's a continuum of what your RPO, RTO requirements are that allows you to then decide where on that continuum you sit on this particular slide. So if you look at backup and restore, your RPO and RTO is a little bit more relaxed. It can be hours, it can be much longer, but essentially this allows you to quickly recover, assuming you have a full backup for all your workloads and applications, assuming that backup has been segregated, has been vaulted, and you have a golden copy of the data. Unfortunately, if your RPO is long, that's the amount of data loss you're willing to tolerate for that given application. Pilot Light and Warm Standby, as you get from left to right, you get into more expensive configurations and much more complicated configurations, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So Pilot Light, by definition, is where you basically have agents, Cloud Endure agents running on premises. You're asynchronously replicating that data to the cloud, and you have a full configuration available in the cloud, and in the event of a disaster, you can initiate a bring up of an alternative environment, and you can have an RPO and RTO in tens of minutes. So in that scenario, if that customer that I talked about on the previous page had such an environment, they had the ability to fail over, they could have done so in a much faster way versus trying to do everything on premises. The third is Warm Standby. Warm Standby is very similar to Pilot Light, the difference being you have a cut-down version of your production environment, maybe not scaled to the number of users, maybe not giving you full performance, but you have a cut-down version of it in a given region, in an isolated region, so in the event of a disaster, you can fail over to it, and you very quickly scale that solution to bring you up to full production workloads. The most expensive and perhaps the most complicated is true active-active multi-site, where you're fully running a production workload on a secondary site, you can very quickly cut over. So depending on your tolerance for RPO, RTO, you can go from the left side to the right side, and our customers vary a lot depending on what the tolerance levels are and which workloads have really migrated to AWS. Atlassian is proactively thinking about mitigating it. They're an important customer of ours. They're using AWS Backup to automate the backup restore and disaster recovery. As I said, you can have the best of intentions. You can have a well-trained staff. You can have the right set of governance policies. You can have the right set of access permissions. If you don't have the right backup and you don't have the backup available on a periodic basis, it's very difficult to recover from a potential attack. So they're planning ahead. They actually are using AWS Backup. They're securing, protecting their S3 environment, and they're also bolstering their ransomware recovery strategy. In conclusion, I'm going to turn it over back to Nancy to talk about a few things on this particular slide, but my key takeaways are, remember, data protection is about people as much as it is about technology. Make sure that your people recognize that in addition to looking at AWS Systems Manager and looking at account and organization level, there are fundamental rich capabilities available within each of our services in our portfolio that they can use to cover the three foundational pillars of data protection and recovery, right? Which is visibility, security, governance, and policies and access control. So make sure you use features like S3 Lens, make features like replication time control, make use of features like access points to not only give you visibility, but make sure the right permissions are there. In addition, I think the additional benefit of using some of those features is you can improve your total cost of ownership and put money back into where your business can deliver better growth and better profitability. Nancy?
Sure, thanks, Satish. And of course, as we covered as part of our baseline controls that exist on AWS, right, make sure that you are able to gain full visibility into your data estate. So that's using a combination of CloudTrail for logging, maybe analyzing your logs, running config to assess configuration changes in your AWS resources, because you can only protect what you see. So super important to have that visibility. Next, a lot of organizations have adopted a best practice around using tags, for example, to control access to sensitive data. So using tags can help standardize that practice across your organization. And as we discussed, backups help maintain the last known good bits. So when things do happen, you have last known good data sets to recover from. So use our central data protection policies that exist with AWS Backup today to make sure that you're backing up your resources on a regular schedule and that you're also able to restore from those backups on a periodic basis. And of course, combine those tagging best practices that we discussed today with attribute-based access controls to power policies that can scale with the speed that you create new data. And finally, for me, data sets that you deem critical in your organization enable data trails with services like CloudTrail so you have full auditability into how those data platforms are being used. Satish, back to you for a final takeaway.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you. Really appreciate the attention. I think we have a few minutes here to take some questions, but Nancy and I will make ourselves available after this session to see if there are any questions you have as well. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, everyone.